start off, I really want to understand and I want to get a little bit of a background of who Abdullah Qureshi is. And then I'd love for you to kind of jump in to some of the stories that formed who you are in terms of, when you grew up, what are the stories and of Pakistan that shaped you, that of the stories of Pakistan that kind of developed the understanding of the country, of the dynamics of the different intricacies that being a Pakistani or a South Asian or a brown person kind of represent for you?
I mean, that's a tough question in the sense that I don't often think about who is Abdullah Qureshi. I mean, you just go on living, right? I don't know if anyone really thinks about who they are on a constant level to be able to articulate it on the spot. I think that I think on a personal level, I would say that being an artist is something that has been an integral part of my identity from the very beginning. I think some of my earliest memories are of drawing and painting. And I remember being appreciated by family as well. Like I remember like my grandmother, my daddy, introducing me to relatives as the drawing master of the family, so she would say things like that. So and I know that my nana would always bring like chart paper and markers for me, and that was always my request, that I want this. So I know from the very beginning this was part of who I wanted to be, and so it was there very early on. I think that in terms of what shaped me about Pakistan and in terms of my brown identity, I think what is important to consider is that I had barely traveled outside Pakistan before the age of 19. Like I'd been on 2 or 3 family trips. Like one was to the US and one was to the UK and one was to Dubai. And so it wasn't that much, right? And most of my exposure was by being in Pakistan. So I don't know if I ever thought about being Pakistani or brown. Like I was just there. I think one thinks about differences in other ways, and I think at that time I hadn't fully articulated my queerness or my queer identity. So I was very much thinking of myself as an artist and thus different. So I think that those were the kind of ways I was thinking about. Incidentally, I think that for the first time I started grappling with these identities was when I moved to London to study, to do my undergraduate studies. I went to Chelsea College of Art in 2006, and basically being in an international context, all of a sudden, I found myself struggling because I never thought about who I was. I never thought about being Pakistani as a dominant aspect of my identity, or being Muslim as a dominant aspect of my identity. And so in many ways, those areas started becoming problematized because to me, my Pakistan was very specific. I mean, it was really Lahore. And so it's very interesting that when we go out, somehow there's the expectation that there would be a singular representation of an entire space, an entire geography, right? And I think that over time, there has been a consistent effort to be conscious of the pluralistic histories and cultures and spaces we come from as people of color. And so I think that for me, it's been about navigating that space with as much awareness as possible.
I'd be curious to, from the point, like it's fascinating how, if we spent most of our time in one place, we forget and we don't put these identities. And I find that in children as well, right? Like if you look at children, they don't put themselves in boxes. It's adults and it's us. And when we're faced with the other, that we start putting ourselves or having to put ourselves in these kinds of boxes. what I'd be curious to kind of understand from you would be कि क्या-क्या चीजें थी, or like when, let's say for instance, you go to London and you are an artist, um, and having spent majority of your time in Pakistan up until 19, as you said, there are things that you learn. There are, like that have been in tune with you, or whether you know it or you don't, they are just like, segments of personality because of the way you've been brought up, the socioeconomic classes, country, city, schools. And there comes a time and an age where we have to actively unlearn what we have learned to be able to open ourselves to take ourselves further and to become a better, quote unquote, better, or um, newer, or however you may want to kind of phrase it, version of ourselves, right? Like whether it be a familial thing, whether it be a socioeconomic thing, whether it be a countrywide thing, there are definitely things that we grow up with that we have to unlearn. I'd be curious to hear from you in your own experience as an artist, as your own experience, and your different experiences. What were some of the things that you had to unlearn to become the person that you are today?
So many things. I think the first memory that comes to my mind is, well, I guess it would go into the conversation about socioeconomic backgrounds. Um, I grew up privileged in Pakistan, and um, and I think I was unaware of that privilege when I was young. And I think the first time I encountered that was when I was learning how to draw. And I would go to Said Akhtar's studio, and everybody over there was kind of like, there was no difference as such over there from his perspective. Everybody would be sitting on the roof in the heat. We would be, there was no special treatment. We would be on the floor on a cushion. So everybody was sitting next to each other. You weren't aware of where you were coming from. And there was this kid sitting next to me, and he started talking to me, and he asked me where I come from, and I said Model Town. And he said, which block? And I said, K block. And he's like, oh, isn't it difficult to get a bus from there? And I was completely taken aback because I was being dropped off by a driver or someone. And I didn't think that anybody had to take, I was fairly young. I didn't think that, anybody had to take a bus to,
Yeah.
come for learning. I think that was the first time like I started realizing privilege, and it's been kind of something that has been consistent, and that's something that I've seen throughout the projects that I've done then, um, in terms of the dividing aspects of socioeconomic privilege in art making. So on a personal level, that's something that I had to unlearn fairly quickly, and to kind of embed into the way I developed programming later on at a project space I used to run, Gallery 39K. To the best of my ability, I tried to make it an inclusive space from that perspective. I think later on, I also started realizing how homogenous Lahore was as a Punjabi space. I think that Punjabi Sunni space. Of course, there are other communities, but you barely hear about it growing up.
Yeah.
And I think the first encounter was actually Karachi, because Karachi is truly, to me, multi-ethnic, and like a diverse city. It's truly a melting pot in the context of Pakistan. And again, I think over there it was just amazing to meet people of different ethnic and religious backgrounds, just hanging out. And as someone from Lahore, I just felt like I was coming from a different. I felt I was coming from the village, and that was also something that I started realizing about the diversity of Pakistan, because I think growing up, this goes back to your earlier question, growing back, I think at least growing up in Lahore, on the most part, one understood Pakistan, being Pakistani, as synonymous with being Muslim, despite the white
Yeah.
in the flag, despite that kind of, that, you know, kind of addendum that was taught in classes that, oh, this is for the minorities, quote unquote minorities of Pakistan. By and large, one understood and assumed that everyone was Muslim. And so I think, and whatever that means, we've seen that in the years to come, even that in Pakistan's
Yeah.
context will become more and more of a singular conversation. But growing up, that was something that was certainly being fed a lot.
Wow. Now, it's fascinating here hearing your perspective and kind of understanding the intricacies of Pakistan, and just like with the way you explain Lahore and Karachi, I think is super interesting. Abdullah, what I'd like to kind of understand from you is actually you just did a solo show in Lahore called Just Come Over. Can you tell us a little bit about that? And then I'll subsequently ask the question that I had around it.
Yeah, I think that for me, it was like, I think that, you know, like in my work for the longest of time as a painter, some of the earlier symbolism that emerged was around the home. I guess this goes back to kind of struggling to figure out my identity. So when I was in London, and, you know, when I didn't know what being Pakistani was or what being Muslim was, I started going back to memories I did have, and those were to do with the home. And at that time, interior objects became a dominant visual vocabulary in my paintings. So you would see the chair, you would see drawers, beds, etc. And in time, I started articulating them within an autobiographical context, thinking about them from the lens of addressing traumatic pasts, histories of sexual abuse, and kind of linking that with that kind of almost a psychoanalytic approach to these objects. And which was interesting because in the earlier days, when I did show paintings of chairs, people were thinking about, would assume that it was about power in the context of Pakistan. Even within Pakistan, people thought that it was about the changing government. But to me, the chair was very specifically a symbol that was emerging from my experience of private tutors. And so it was something that that has been part of my vocabulary, like, you know, kind of going back and forth. And I would say that in some ways, my transition to more abstract work was a way to avoid having the conversations that I didn't want to have at that time. I think that at the time, people would then start asking questions about, and I'm fairly open about talking about my own history of abuse and kind of questions around that and its relationship with sexuality. But at the time, these were conversations that I wasn't so confident about having, because in many ways I didn't have the answers that people wanted of me. And I think so I started like, okay, I'm going to avoid this conversation. So I just started having more abstract work. That's not to say that somehow it was ingenuine, because it was something that I was equally interested in. But this shift between abstraction and representational language has also coincided within my life with how much I want to be open about certain conversations. So I think with coming back to this particular show in this particular moment is that being in quarantine and being back in Pakistan, being stuck at home, which had traumatic histories in my case, but at the same time, being in a different place in life, feeling more safe and secure, I felt it was interesting to be living with the same objects that I painted many years ago, the same places that I painted like 15 years ago, right? So I think that I started going back to that. You know, I think Just Come Over is kind of, in some ways, it's a very simple title, but in other ways, it's also like my mother constantly saying, just come over, or in quarantine, we're kind of thinking about, you know, like smaller bubbles. And again, there's nowhere to go out. So you're like, just come over. But I think just come over for me especially thinking about being at home, is complex because it's not always an easy journey to make.
Yeah.
And so I think that I started painting with the same chairs, with the same bed, the same drawers, and then eventually kind of opening it up to other concerns. But it was very much about being in that very space to reconnect with the home, if you like. I think there's a painting or two in the show that is of a specific tree, and that tree was planted when I was born. And so it's kind of also kind of thinking about the relationship with space in that sense. And so yeah, so I think that's very much where the show comes from.
I mean, it's really fascinating to kind of understand the different themes that you just spoke about, because like to an outsider, you know, just come over is also a cultural thing in Pakistan, right? Like no one makes plans and just come over. But getting the perspective of these objects and getting the perspective of the way you're thinking about it, of, you know, reliving these moments, like bringing the Abdullah from the past and the Abdullah from the present, and being able to kind of restart or reinvigorate these conversations, I think for me also exemplifies the last year. You know, a lot of people, me included, like, you know, we go away, and yet because of having been forced or being put in situations where like we physically are not allowed out, you know, you have to kind of really delve deeper and relive those experiences, kind of have those conversations that you either are avoiding or looking at, and it kind of just begins like this year of looking within and looking at your little char divari, as you say, like, you know, as to what's happening around you. So I think that was fascinating, and these were also some of the things that kind of were coming in my mind. I just wanted to get your perspective, and I think it's lovely to kind of hear. How did the people that came to the show interact and react to the information that you uncovered about yourself through these paintings and published? And how was their reaction personally looking at these objects and looking at these paintings? And what were some of the feelings that they had? And subsequently, how does it change your perspective and understanding of this work? And how does it change your perspective around Pakistan?
I think contextually, there was very little information for people. Like there was only like a small paragraph that was talking about the fact that I used to paint interior objects for a long time, and I'm returning to them in the context of the home quarantine. And there were titles to the work, but even the titles in the work, I made a conscious decision to not have in the space. They were as kind of like this online e-catalog that people could access. But I wanted the space to be a physical experience as much as possible, right? And I was fortunate that this was a very big space, so we could have this exhibition, one in a safe way, but also in a way that I could spread throughout. And it was an old shoe factory, actually. So it was like this warehouse context, recently converted by the colony.
Yeah.
And as a arts performative venue. And so when they were opening up this gallery, I jumped at that opportunity. And I think that the way I worked, I mean, there were a few things that I did consciously. I think that in preparing for the exhibition, I went in further isolation. I was in contact with very few people, of course, my immediate family, but also I think only like 2 or 3 friends that I was in contact with. And if anybody else asked, I just kind of wriggled my way out of it, mainly because I just wanted to be focused on work. And also I didn't know how safe it was truly at this point. And so I basically was painting on my own, and I was also conscious of not sharing any images on social media, because I think then the work somehow becomes final. And I wanted to sit with the work for longer. I wanted to be able to go back to the same painting that I made, let's say, a few weeks ago and rework it. I wanted that opportunity. So I was going through a lot of an internal process in these paintings, I think. And so when the work was finalized and it was time to go into the space, what was interesting was that there was like a broad range of things happening. I mean, I think I went from object-based paintings to figure-based paintings to complete abstract paintings that are simply about color. And it was a slight fear that how will I contextualize this in the space? Will it make sense, or will it look like work of two different people or even the same person for different exhibitions? And I think the space lent itself to this challenge very well, because in the actual physical space, then working with Rakshan Datwar, who's my main mentor, we were able to curate the experience in such a way that the viewer kind of moves, when the viewer enters, they're kind of engulfed in this abstract explosion of color. You enter into the space and there are these large paintings that surround you, and it's a pure explosion of color and kind of painterly movement.
Yeah.
And then slowly, as you move through the show, slow forms start emerging. So you see a few branches, you see like a few of my dogs emerge in abstract forms. And then you go into the next room, and that's where the figures open up, and that's where the chairs come in. So it kind of allows the viewer to also move and navigate in the space. And I think that there were many responses by the audience. Quite honestly, I think that I'm blessed. People have been overwhelmingly appreciating my work, for sure. And at the same time, I think part of it is that people haven't seen so many exhibitions in the past year.
Yeah.
So we kind of started 2021 with a big show. There's more than 27 paintings in the show.
Wow.
So it's quite large in its scale. And also the paintings tend to be of large scale. So I think it occupies a lot of physical space in terms of experience. So I think people were responding well to that. And so I think that's what it is. And I hadn't shown Pakistan for the last 3 years or so properly. My last solo exhibition was in 2017, I believe, in Islamabad. And before that at the NCA in the same year in Lahore. And so it's been quite some time before I've had a proper show in Pakistan. So people were also excited to see me present.
That's awesome. Abdullah, last question for you, which would be, how do you unpack Pakistan when someone asks you now in Toronto, or whenever you're in Helsinki or Marseille or wherever else you travel? How do you unpack Pakistan when someone asks you what Pakistan is like?
I mean, I think I'm fairly honest that I say that, like any space, it's complex and diverse. I always give a geographical context, explaining people how it's located. Like I say that, it's kind of, it's located between India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Iran. And what you have is kind of going from the Himalayas to the Arabian Sea with everything in between, right?
Yeah.
So it's a diverse geography. And so can you imagine the diversity of people in between? So to kind of make that a singular conversation is somehow reductive. So I think people get that on the most part now, at least with a lot more kind of conversation in the media around these issues. And I'm also fairly honest about the fact that I come from Lahore, which is the second largest city in Pakistan. So I come with a very different experience to someone who may be coming from a smaller town in Pakistan. So I think I try to kind of be as honest about that as possible and talk about the differences as you move in different Pakistani cities. Um, and so I don't know. I think that I talk about that, and I kind of say that it's a great space you should visit. And I also give a disclaimer that that doesn't mean that you can go to all parts, mainly because
Yeah.
of um, security challenges that are not only for foreigners but also for local people, sadly. But at the same time, a lot of Pakistan is worth visiting, and people should just visit themselves.